All right. So, 4 important questions. What is energy and how does it transfer? And I know that's 2 questions in 1 question, but this is how you could turn 4 questions into 5. And I like that. Or when you turn an answer into a question, that's maybe my favorite thing to do. What kinds of processes are spontaneous? What are the kinetics of ATP hydrolysis? So if a cell is making and breaking 100 pounds of ATP every day, it's helpful to know how much energy is that actually releasing every time you hydrolyze ATP, and how much energy does it require to put it back together, and how can the cell fuel endergonic processes. First question, what is energy and how does it transfer? Now this one, you have certainly talked about this many, many times in chemistry. Energy is the capacity to do work. The capacity to do work. And so this is a wonderful way to think about energy because it allows there to be potential energy, because it's not, you don't have to actively be doing work. It could be the potential to do work. So like a molecule of ATP can have energy even though that energy is not doing any work. It says chemical potential energy. And thermodynamics is the study of energy and its transformation. So, I mean, thermodynamics is just, it's one of those subjects that transcends discipline. You cover thermodynamics in biology, obviously, because we're in biology right now and we're talking about thermodynamics. Talk about thermodynamics in chemistry and in physics. And it's just something that transcends discipline because it governs so much of how the world works. According to the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but instead transferred from one form to another. And then as far as living organisms are concerned, these are the forms of energy that we are interested in. Heat energy, chemical energy, electrical energy, and this is not like, you get struck by lightning, although that is electrical energy. Mechanical energy, and then radiant energy. These are the forms of energy we are most interested in as far as living systems are concerned. And then kinetic energy, of course, is the energy of an object in motion. And we will certainly be concerned with this, and we will talk a lot about this next week. Where do you have kinetic energy in living systems, and what is it doing? What is it doing? And you're like, I know where there's kinetic energy in living systems because I've watched the Lumberjack games. If you ever watched the Lumberjack games, it is one of the greatest things to watch on television because literally nobody alive needs those skills for anything. Where somebody's got to like chop out sections of a tree so that they can scale this 200-foot tall tree. And so they're 100 feet off the ground with a hatchet cutting out new footholds. You're like, I love this. I don't know why I love this, but I feel like I've been missing it my entire life, and I wish I always watched it. So you can see kinetic energy, but we'll talk about within cells because this is cell biology. Potential energy, stored energy, we are very concerned with this, and we'll talk a lot about this today. How much energy is actually stored up in an individual molecule of ATP? How much energy is there? How much energy is stored up in a single molecule of glucose? In a single molecule of glucose. All right, so energy can be transferred from the system to the surroundings and vice versa. And so in biological systems, we tend to refer to the organism as the system, which because it's convenient, right? The organism is your system, everything else is the surroundings. But this is not a typical biology class. This is a cell biology class. So we tend to refer to single cells as the system and everything else is the surroundings. So we tend to track energy flow within single cells, and it's fun. It's fun. You're going to love it. You're going to love it. How often when I tell you you're going to love something, do you actually love it? Has it ever happened? 50%. That's very gracious of you. What a day to say something like that when we're talking about grace, today. So these systems can be closed, open, or isolated. A closed system can still exchange energy, but not matter. An open system can exchange both energy and matter, and an isolated system can exchange neither. Now, as far as what we're concerned with in this class, everything is an open system. Everything in this class is an open system, exchanging both matter and energy, and oftentimes both at the same time, because the energy transfer is in the form of potential energy in matter. And you're like, that's cool. You're like, Dr. Ingo, I really do love it. I really do. So here's a closed system. Energy can still transfer between the system and the surroundings, but matter cannot. Here's an open system. And again, this is what we're going to deal with in this class, our open systems. You are an open system. Every cell in your body is an open system, exchanging both matter and energy. And then here's an isolated system where neither energy nor matter are exchanged. All right, so because this is a biology class, we just have to really quickly talk about that the source of energy on Earth comes from radiant energy from sunlight. Although some of it, you're like, no, Dr. Ingo, that's not all of it, because some of it comes from the core of the Earth in the form of, heat energy released from hydrothermal vents, right? That's true, but the bulk of it comes from radiant energy from the sun. So even the Earth as a whole is an open system, exchanging both matter and energy with its surroundings. And it's exchanging matter in more ways than just when you have a meteorite strike the surface of Earth. That doesn't happen all that often, but it still exchanges matter. I believe that the Earth is, I forget how much, but it's losing a pretty significant amount of matter every year. And a lot of it gets taken up by the moon. It's so giving, like we're giving it something to our little brother. I never gave anything to my little brother. Maybe I should have. All right, so what kinds of processes are spontaneous? What kinds of processes are spontaneous? So you know this from chemistry, that processes that release energy or become more disordered tend to be spontaneous. So if a process releases energy or the system becomes more disordered in the process, those are going to tend to be spontaneous processes. And if it can do both, if it can release energy and gain disorder, I mean, that's really good. That's really spontaneous. And this is kind of what happens to fuel diffusion, that both things are happening. Energy is being released and things are becoming more disordered. All right. So products, in these situations, will tend to have less potential energy enthalpy than the reactants in spontaneous processes. It's not always the case, but it's mostly the case. And then we've got a couple of terms that you've talked about in chemistry, I'm sure. Exothermic reactions release energy. Endothermic reactions absorb energy. And then the products tend to be less ordered, more random than the reactants. This is why, have you ever noticed if you dump water out on a table, I've got a little bit of water here, that eventually it'll all evaporate. And you're like, that's fantastic. I didn't know that this little puddle of water here is going to get up to 100 degrees Celsius. Because it's not. But it's still going to evaporate. And you're like, wait, I thought water evaporates at 100 degrees Celsius. What's going on there? So yeah, at 100 degrees Celsius, bless you, is where all the hydrogen bonds are broken and water is vaporized. But individual water molecules will escape even at lower temperatures than that. And so eventually this puddle will disappear. I'm curious to see if it'll be around on Monday. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to think about this all weekend. I'll be like, I wonder how my puddle's doing. All right. Second law of thermodynamics states that the total disorder of the universe is always increasing. That the disorder of the universe is increasing. The second law of thermodynamics, notice, does not say that you cannot increase the order of a system. Okay? It does not say that. It just says that the disorder of the universe is increasing. So, because as you grow and develop, you are becoming more ordered. As you build complex organic molecules, you are becoming more ordered. And so you really only see this when you consider everything going on about an organism, when you consider all of the nutrients coming in and all of the waste going out, when you look at an organism holistically. You're like, I don't ever want to look at an organism holistically because it's gross. It's right. Life is messy. It's gross. But it's life and it's beautiful, right? Okay. A couple more terms. Portion of a system's energy that is available to do work is called its free energy. Most common way we measure this is Gibbs free energy, and delta G, or the change in Gibbs free energy, is equal to the change in enthalpy minus the temperature times the change in entropy. That's a scratch on the screen. Did one of you do this? It's messed up. You know that's going to mess with me. Now I'm not going to be able to think about my puddle this weekend. I'm going to think about the scratch on the screen. Oh, man, I love Fridays. They're just wonderful thoughts come into my mind because I don't have to like be thinking about what's coming next because it's the weekend, right? The only thing I have to do over the weekends is keep my kids alive, which is pretty easily. You just sprinkle some food on the floor, you know, and intervene when they get into fights. I don't feed my children from the floor. But if they drop their own food on the floor, they usually eat it, and I don't stop them. I think it's funny. All right, so delta G illustrates spontaneity, or basically whether or not a reaction is going to happen without the input of energy, without the input of a directional force. Now, it's important to understand that living organisms never reach a state of equilibrium. So in chemistry, you're always, not always, but oftentimes with reactions, you're concerned with finding the equilibrium point, right? At which point where will our rate of the forward reaction equal the rate of the reverse reaction? Okay? You don't care about that in living organisms because living organisms never reach equilibrium. The cells invest an enormous amount of energy not being in equilibrium. The only time living cells reach equilibrium is at the point at which they are no longer living and they are no longer investing energy to, keep away from equilibrium. So dead cells, senescent cells, will reach equilibrium, but not living cells. Okay, so here's an illustration of the equilibrium point. Here we've got a lot of reactant. We've got this big giant arrow pushing the reaction towards the product side. And under these conditions, your delta G is going to be negative. It's going to be a spontaneous process, right? Here we've got some reactant already forming. So our forward arrow is not quite as thick and impressive, although we are still shifting this towards the product side because we have way more reactant than we do product. Delta G is still less than zero, still negative, still a spontaneous process. And then here at the point at which we've reached equilibrium, the rate at which your reactant is being converted into product is matched by the rate at which your product is being converted back into reactant, and you have reached equilibrium, at which point delta G is now zero, is no longer a spontaneous process. But again, we don't care about equilibrium in living systems. You're like, Dr. Engel, then why are you teaching this if we don't care about equilibrium in living systems? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe to just show that how we approach the area of thermodynamics from biology is a little bit different than the way you approach it in other sciences. All right, so we got one more question to deal with, and then we will do our lecture break. What are the kinetics of ATP hydrolysis? All right, so ATP is adenosine triphosphate. And the bonds between the phosphate groups are unstable. And what we mean by unstable is that they are easily broken. Okay? Not that they are less stable than if the bonds aren't in place, because you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Bonds form so that electrons can be in a lower energy level and kind of a more stable arrangement. But what we mean by this is that they are easily broken. Okay, the bonds between these phosphate groups. The hydrolysis of ATP is exergonic, and it is spontaneous. It releases energy, and it's spontaneous. Delta G is negative. It releases energy and it increases disorder. Right? Because you've taken ATP and you've broken it into two pieces. It is less ordered. In the same way, if you took your sandwich and broke it into two pieces, it's less ordered. So just eat the whole thing all in one piece, you know? Do you play the sandwich game? Do any of you know about the sandwich game? I can't tell you about the game because then you're going to have to play it. So if you want to know about the sandwich game, you can come have that conversation with me individually. But once you know the rules, you're in the game. And so I can't tell it to this big of a group. But anyways, that's what I thought of when I thought about the sandwich game. So here's the hydrolysis of ATP. Why is water listed as a reactant? Because we're cutting with water, right? When water is a product in the reverse reaction. And what reaction is the reverse of a hydrolysis reaction? A condensation or dehydration reaction. Good. So here's ATP and water to produce ADP and inorganic phosphate. Although, you know, this water, it has to go to something as well, but the water is now inside of these molecules. Part of the water's here on ADP, part of the water's there on the inorganic phosphate. So delta G of this reaction is typically negative 7.3 kilocals per mole. And the importance there is typically, because it depends on how much ADP you have. If you've got a ton of ADP, you have a ton of product, delta G is not going to be as negative as what it typically is, right? Maybe that's why I showed you the diagram in the previous slide. Because if you've got a lot of ADP and ATP and inorganic phosphate, you've got a lot of product of this reaction, the delta G is not going to be as negative. There's not going to be as much of an urge to break more ATP. Now, ADP can be further hydrolyzed into AMP and inorganic phosphate. What do you think the M stands for? Yeah, have we played this before? I feel like we played that game before. So ATP is constantly resynthesized by the reverse reaction, which is endergonic and non-spontaneous, and requires energy. And the energy to do that comes from food molecules. And look at this. So you know what it takes to get 100 pounds of ATP made and broken in every cell in your body every day? It requires you to make and break 10 million molecules of ATP every second in every cell. That's a lot. I don't know if you knew this or not, but 10 million is a lot. You know, I never really thought about how much a billion is until my daughter asked me if I could count to 8 billion. She's like, Dad, could you count to 8 billion? I said, sure I could. And she's like, how long would it take? And I was like, and I answered her question with a question. I said, well, how many numbers do you count a minute? And she's like, I don't know what that means. And so I decided if you could count 100 numbers a minute, which I think is like a fairly fast counting rate, it would take 53 years to count to 8 billion. That's a big number. That helped me visualize how big a billion is better than anything else. So 10 million, if you want to visualize how big that number is, figure out how long it would take you to count to 10 million, counting 100 numbers a second. It's a long time. It's a long time. All right. So here's ATP, ADP, and AMP. Notice the oxygen here, which means that this sugar is not what? It is not deoxyribose, because deoxyribose doesn't have the oxygen here, which is why we call it deoxy, right? So this is ribose. So this is an RNA nucleotide, meaning the same thing that you would use to put an A into an RNA transcript that you're writing from reading the DNA is the energy currency of the cell. Like, that's so wonderful. It just seems like such a great way to make use of what you're going to have a lot of in multiple ways. It'd be like if you use money to also build things. You're like, I need a piece of furniture, I'm going to build it out of money. which you're like, wow, you'd have to have a lot of money to do that. Wouldn't that be cool? You go over to somebody's house and they have like a chair built out of $100 bills. That'd feel good to sit in a chair like that. No? Oh, I think that'd be cool. All right, so here's the hydrolysis of ATP, water as a product, and then the water molecules are, part of it's here on this phosphate, part of it's here on this phosphate. Here's the ATP ADP cycle, and this is a really, really important diagram to just kind of spend some time with and figure out what this is saying. So notice in this cycle we have energy both leaving and entering this cycle. And it's a really good reminder that yes, breaking ATP releases energy, but also yes, it means you need more energy to rebuild it. You need more energy to rebuild it. And that makes sense, right? If you're going to spend money, you need a way to get it back. You need a way to get it back. That puddle's doing nicely. It's still the same size. None of it's evaporated yet. All right, so we need to take ourselves a little bit of a lecture break. And what I want you to do is this. What I want you to do is figure out how a cell can take the energy released by hydrolyzing ATP and use it to do something with it. So I want you to think about what form of energy are you actually producing. Now, you're not producing the energy altogether, but you're producing a particular form of it, right? So what form of energy are you actually producing when you break that bond? Okay? When you hydrolyze that bond, what form of energy are you releasing? And then I want you to think about how does the cell harness that energy to actually do something? Okay? I want you to think through this. Take a couple minutes with those around you. Talk through this, and I want you to just think through this. What kind of energy are we releasing here? All right? 2 minutes, starting now.
Yeah, so it's just like still. So when you, for example, you know how when you break something, there is that part where it has that energy has been transformed from potential to others. So now so it's not chemical, yes, potential. In the bonds, you know, bonds are got like bundle of forces. So that potential is converted the force, yeah, the electron.
No, oh, we will go back. Oh,
Keeps attracting.
All right. We have some thoughts? Okay, I will tell you this. The absolutely worst energy for a living organism to produce is heat energy, unless the organism is endothermic. So endothermic organisms, the bulk of their internal energy comes from their own processes, right? And then you have to produce a lot of heat. Other than that, producing heat is about as useless an energy as an organism can provide, okay? Which may clue you into, as we break this bond, we're not releasing heat. Okay, so what's going on? What type of energy are we releasing when we break that bond, Levi?
I don't know if it's right, but I kind of imagine it as like kinetic energy, like you break the bond and it makes the protein like just kind of flip and change shape to do whatever it needs to do.
Okay.
Is that close?
It's certainly, I will tell you this, some of the energy generated when you break bonds is certainly going to be kinetic energy. Now, how much of that can be harnessed? That's a different question. There's certainly some aspect of that's what's happening. As you break a bond, you're certainly going to release some of that energy as kinetic energy. Yeah, Micah. Well, kinetic energy generates heat, but kinetic energy and now heat. Yes. So temperature is a measurement of the average kinetic energy, right? But we use the term heat to basically just refer to where all you've done is just kind of increase the average kinetic energy of everything, right? Where it's not, it wasn't like harnessed in a very specific place. Yeah, that's a good question though. But yes, I mean, heat is a measurement, or temperature is a measurement of the average kinetic energy, and so heat is going to be an increase in just the average kinetic energy of everything. The reason why heat is useless is because, not completely useless, especially if you're endothermic, heat is essential, is because it's undirected, right? It's undirected and very uncontrollable. And so, like, when you produce heat inside like a combustion engine, it's a problem because it's not focused, right? It's not focused, it's not directed in the same way, the kinetic energy of a single entity is. Yeah.
I think it's kinetic energy in the sense that it's also partially chemical energy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, in the sense that since we are dealing with molecules that are chemically composed, like they are made of chemicals, and so you need the chemical energy to drive them in certain directions. Absolutely.
And chemical energy hovers around where are the electrons? Where are the electrons? Some interesting things happen when you start breaking bonds. When you start breaking bonds, because you have to remember, bonds form, especially covalent bonds, and that's what's in between our phosphate groups, our covalent bonds, right? Bonds form in such a way to get the atoms to basically have a certain amount of electrons in their highest energy level, right? And they don't exactly have them. They're just kind of sharing them, but it fills up all of their orbitals. When you start breaking bonds, some interesting things happen. First of all, some of the time you actually release individual electrons that you can feel to do a lot. But you do have very directed and very focused chemical changes. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So a lot of it is going to be kinetic energy, Levi. And a lot of it's going to be just kind of changing the orientation of molecules because of this chemical energy, right? As we start to break bonds, and it changes the orientation of certain chemicals, we're generating some kind of we're generating a form of energy that is just chemical energy. Okay, and it's like can be used to change the conformation of something, right? So as you break ATP, it might change the shape of the protein that breaks it, or change the shape of something else that was coupled along with that. Yeah.
Like potential energy, basically?
Well, there's chemical potential energy in there for sure. And then when you start breaking bonds, a lot of it is converted into kinetic energy, and a lot of it is just used to kind of change the shape of certain things. Like, so think about kinesin. That kinesin, that motor protein that walks vesicles along microtubules. When it hydrolyzes ATP, it changes its shape, which moves it further down the microtubule. And as it hydrolyzes another ATP, it changes shape again and gets it to take another step. And so what that is it's being converted partially into kinetic energy, and part of it's hard to define it as kinetic energy, but it changes the shape of what's hydrolyzing the ATP. Now, sometimes it's used to create torsional strain to break other bonds. Okay, but we'll get to that in a minute. So how can the cell fuel endergonic processes? First of all, an endergonic process, anything in which the reactants actually gain free energy. So the reactants have higher free energy than the products have higher free energy than the reactants do. It's an endergonic process. And all of these processes have to be coupled with an exergonic, one in which the products have less free energy than the reactants. So if you want to fuel an endergonic process, such as the condensation reaction of ADP and phosphate, right, to make ATP, that is an endergonic process. ATP has more free energy than ADP and the inorganic phosphate do. Okay, so our product has more free energy. It's an endergonic process. It has to be coupled with an exergonic process, which we'll talk a lot about next week. This process is called coupling. And it requires a single enzyme to facilitate both reactions, to facilitate the hydrolysis of ATP and whatever reaction is being fueled by that process. And so that's where you can see very clearly that we're trapping some of this chemical energy to change the conformation of something else, change the shape of something else. Now, sometimes these reactions are done in a whole series of reactions. And if you take all of the reactions happening inside of an organism, we call that metabolism. And so we can string together several reactions in a series to build molecules or to break down molecules. Okay, so we have catabolic series that break complex molecules down. We're going to talk about this all next week. One big example of a whole series of catabolic reactions called cellular respiration. The week after that, we're going to talk about an anabolic process, a whole series of reactions that build up complex molecules, and that's photosynthesis. But both of these are happening inside of every cell in your body. Catabolic processes where you're breaking down food molecules, and then anabolic process where you're building the complex machinery necessary for your cell to function. Bless you. Bless you. Any questions about that? All right. So here's an exergonic reaction. Notice the products have less free energy than our reactants do. So our free energy decreases, meaning this reaction is typically going to release energy. Okay? If it's not releasing energy, these products must be significantly more disordered than the reactants were. Here's an endergonic. There's an endergonic reaction. And so here the products have more free energy than the reactants, meaning you're typically going to either need to invest a lot of energy or you're going to have to significantly decrease the disorder, increase the order of a system, both of which are going to require energy input. Oh boy. Oh boy. Look at that. Just coming in pieces. There we go. And so here's a great example of an endergonic process that happens in every cell in your body. And so here is glutamic or glutamic acid reacting with ammonia to form glutamine, one of our amino acids. Now, notice our delta G is positive, which tells us that it is not spontaneous and that it is an endergonic reaction. That glutamine has more free energy than glutamic acid and ammonia do by themselves. Okay? The only way we can fuel this is if we input energy. Notice the same enzyme that facilitates this reaction is also going to hydrolyze ATP. So as it hydrolyzes ATP, it can couple that with this reaction here. Okay? It can couple that with this reaction here to change glutamic acid into glutamyl phosphate, and then to change that ultimately with ammonia into glutamine and re-release this inorganic phosphate. And so when you couple these two reactions together, we get that the net delta G of these two coupled reactions carried out by the same enzyme has a negative delta G. Okay? And so we take a reaction that is non-spontaneous, couple it with a reaction that is very spontaneous, and overall you get a process that is spontaneous. And you're like, cool, if it's spontaneous, it'll happen. And yes, but the reason why we need enzymes is because this will not happen on a scale conducive to life. Okay, we need these to happen rapidly. If your life depends on your ability to make glutamine, which it does, you have to make a lot of it. And you have to make it really quickly. Any questions? So now we need to start putting a lot of biology flavor on this whole thing and start talking about enzymes. The biological catalysts. Biological flavor. That's a good way to think about it. Right? You take something bland like thermodynamics and you sprinkle it with some biological flavor. Now it tastes good. It's palatable. Okay. What do enzymes do? What do enzymes do? Simply put, enzymes act as biological catalysts. Enzymes act as biological catalysts. Have any of you done like the elephant toothpaste reaction? You done that before, where you take peroxide and you basically use a catalyst to encourage the transfer or the switch of peroxide into water and oxygen gas? And so you use a catalyst. What catalyst do you use? Do you use potassium iodide? I think you do use potassium iodide. Anyways, you use a catalyst. And so typically what would take forever for peroxide to convert into water and oxygen gas, you put that catalyst in and it happens like that. Which is super cool because you start to generate a lot of oxygen gas. And you're like, this is so cool. Everybody loves oxygen. But what makes it really cool is you put a little dish soap in there that can trap that oxygen gas. Then you get this just massive like foam that starts to form. But it's kind of nasty looking because it's got potassium iodide in it, which is like brownish orange. But anyways, it's called the elephant toothpaste reaction. It's kind of cool. But these are biological catalysts. So what catalysts do is they increase reaction rate. They increase the reaction rate. And this is something really important to remember, is even spontaneous reactions have to happen way faster than they would happen without a catalyst. Okay? So even spontaneous reactions like the hydrolysis of ATP, that is a spontaneous reaction. If you put ATP in water, that water is going to hydrolyze ATP. But it's not going to happen 10 million times every second without a catalyst. Okay? Which is why we have enzymes that hydrolyze ATP. So the way they do this is by lowering the activation energy. They lower the activation energy. And so if you're going to break a bond, even if breaking that bond releases an enormous amount of chemical and kinetic energy, right? So breaking that bond releases an enormous amount of chemical and kinetic energy. You still have to break the bond. It still requires some effort, right? And so we've got to lower the amount of energy necessary to break those bonds. And so that's what we do. We lower the activation energy. And enzymes do this by stabilizing the transition state. The state at which, if you're breaking a bond, you put some serious torsional strain on it. Okay? You put some serious torsional strain on that bond. And so here's how enzymes stabilize the transition state. They bring the reactants together. So the late Dr. Jones, which I don't think any of you ever met Dr. Jones, but you met Dr. Jones. Yeah. So Dr. Jones taught here for a long time. He taught me chemistry. He taught me general chemistry and organic chemistry. Whenever he talked about catalysts, he used this example, and I thought it's a pretty good one. So imagine you are at a junior high dance, okay? You're at a junior high dance, and you have 40 kids there. All of your boys are as far away as they could get from where all the girls are, right? And so eventually, I mean, you're like, we were at a dance. and we've got partners, eventually the dance is going to happen, right? But without a catalyst, man, it's not going to happen on a scale that's really meaningful, right? You might go that entire dance and nothing happens. But you get a catalyst. You get that one person that starts the train, right? And then everybody follows, right? Nobody wants to be the first one. Did any of you go to junior high dances when you were in junior high? Man, they are awesome. They are awesome. Have any of you ever chaperoned a junior high dance? Yeah, oh boy, it is fun. It is fun. Anyways, that's another story for another time. So bring the reactants together, right? Bring the dance partners together. Yeah, like Dr. It's simple. Just play some what do we the square dancing music? What do we use for square dancing? Yeah, I mean you could play that, but I was just thinking more generally. What do we call that type of music? Country. Like bluegrass, right? Play some bluegrass. Country. You can play country music. All right. Another way enzymes do this is they expose the enzymes to alternative charges, right? If you want to break a covalent bond, you can present something supercharged to it, right? So oxygen will make covalent bonds, yes? Oxygen will make covalent bonds with other oxygen atoms. It'll make covalent bonds with carbon atoms. It'll make covalent bonds with nitrogen atoms. But you know what oxygen really likes? Something that's going to give it an electron, right? And so you can present these reactants to alternative charges. And then enzymes also change the shape of reactants. And these are three ways in which enzymes stabilize the transition state and so require less energy input to break the bonds and release all the energy. Break the bonds and release all the energy. This is a good diagram. I like this diagram. So here's an illustration of this. So this rock has an enormous amount of potential energy, just like ATP has an enormous amount of potential energy. But in order to access this potential energy, we need to push this rock over this small hill. Okay? And you're like, what on earth would we need a massive boulder for? Maybe you want to crush a car, right? So it fits better into a pile of cars. You know what? You can use the kinetic energy of this boulder and it'll do a wonderful job crushing the car, right? Or you're like, maybe I need to move my house. I don't like where it is. I need a massive boulder. Just give it a little push. Give it a little push. Or maybe I need to wake somebody up in the morning, right? Just need a little push, a little encouragement. So here's our activation energy, and this is just like ATP. ATP's got an enormous amount of chemical potential energy that we can use to fuel a lot of processes, to convert into kinetic and some chemical energy, but we've got to overcome some activation energy. Oh, here's this illustrated, but without the boulder. Less cool. But here's what an enzyme does. So here's the activation energy without the enzyme. So the products still have less free energy than the reactants do. So it's an exergonic process. It's spontaneous. It'll happen eventually. Eventually you'll be able to get enough energy into that from maybe heat, some of the kinetic energy from the surrounding molecules. But what enzymes do is drop that activation energy to a point at which it's going to happen quickly and soon. Like in a cell where there's plenty of kinetic energy, there's plenty of materials moving around, there's plenty of chemical energy. If you can lower the activation energy, man, this is going to happen 10 million times every second in every cell. Hydrolysis of ATP. All right. So this is cool, right? You love this. You're like, Dr. Engel, you told me I was going to love it. I really do. I really do love it. But I feel like all you've given me is an appetizer and I'm waiting for the full meal. Here it is. So how do enzymes work exactly? We talk about that they stabilize the transition state, but you're like, okay, but how do we actually do this? How do we actually do this? First thing we need to mention is this. Enzymes do not change the delta G of a reaction. So the delta G of the hydrolysis of ATP is about -7 kilocals per mole, right? That's true whether or not you catalyze that reaction with an enzyme. What enzymes do is they just speed up the rate of the reaction. Also, something to point out, enzymes do not function as a reactant. They are not used up in the reaction. They may become saturated, but they do not get used up by the reaction. Once that reaction is done, that enzyme's free to do it again. It's free to do it again. Okay. I was going to think of an analogy, but one didn't come to me right away, so I'm going to move on. So there are two different views of how this works exactly. One is that enzymes are shaped perfectly to bind certain substrates. And the substrate is a general term that refers to anything bound by an enzyme. Okay? And so that the enzyme, let's say it's an enzyme that hydrolyzes ATP. One idea is that that enzyme is shaped perfectly for ATP. We call this the lock and key model. That ATP's the key and the enzyme's the lock. Okay? And the lock is shaped perfectly for that key. So that's one idea. And so the other idea is that the enzyme's not shaped perfectly to bind a particular substrate, but it does have an active site that attracts a particular substrate. So the enzyme has an active site that the chemistry there is going to attract a particular type of substrate. And once that enzyme binds the substrate, the enzyme and the substrate change shape, putting strain on bonds. So that first one's lock and key. The enzyme is shaped perfectly for that substrate, right? The substrate's the key, the enzyme's the lock. This one is called the induced fit. That the enzymes, it's not perfectly shaped for that substrate, but it's got an active site that's going to attract a particular substrate. Once that substrate comes, the enzyme and the substrate change shape to put strain on bonds. And so this is the induced fit. It'd be like the lock isn't perfectly shaped for that key until the key shows up, and then it changes the shape of the lock to open it. Like, man, it's so cool. It makes the lock so much more sophisticated. Now, many enzymes are made and synthesized, but they are in an inactive state, right? So that the cell can prepare for a future event, right? So the cell can make a lot of these enzymes, but the enzymes are in an inactive state until they have a cofactor. And so a cofactor tends to be a non-protein material that changes the enzyme. It changes the enzyme and activates it. Some of these cofactors are organic molecules, and when they are, we call these coenzymes. And a lot of these coenzymes are derived from vitamins. And this is the reason why you need certain vitamins in your diet, because they activate enzymes that have to work. And the enzyme can't work without that coenzyme, without that organic molecule. Yeah, Noah.
Did you say it's either one of the two, like both exist, or that?
Yeah, they're two kind of different ideas of how enzymes work. Yeah, they're two different. I mean, the reality is it's probably a little bit of both. That the enzyme is maybe not shaped perfectly, but shaped in such a way to attract particular reactants, and the chemistry of its binding site is just right. So it's probably a little bit of both, but they at the beginning were basically rival ideas for how enzymes function. That's a good question. So here's an enzyme with its particular substrate, and whether it's induced fit or lock and key, you've got this enzyme that's basically substrate specific. And notice here we're showing that the enzyme's changing shape a little bit. That's what those arrows are illustrating, putting strain on bonds. And so here's showing you the enzymatic breakdown of lactose. This enzyme is called lactase. And you can get this in like a soluble form and consume before you eat dairy products if you are lactose intolerant and you consume like a soluble form of this enzyme. And so the enzyme takes this their beta galactosidase, just another enzyme, lactase will work for it, same name, or it's different names, same enzyme. And so it takes this lactose molecule and it binds that lactose molecule, stabilizes the transition state where we put some torsional strain on this bond, and then breaks those bonds into glucose and galactose, sugars that are much easier for cells to deal with. All right. So here's where we're at. We have about 20 seconds left of class. And we got 2/3 of the way through chapter 6. So we didn't get all the way through, but I told you it was okay if we didn't. But this is a good place to stop. So I want you to leave with this message. I want you to have a wonderful Friday and just an outrageously good weekend. I mean, just outrageously good. Because you know next weekend's going to be good because there's no school following next weekend. So it's like having what would that be, like a 9-day weekend? That's about as good as a weekend gets.